Okay, great. Thanks for joining me. So I'm going to talk about the ethics of sustainability. So I'm going to look at some of the ideas which underlie our general ethical outlook, or a particular ethical outlook that I'm going to be arguing for, and see how that applies to ethics, applies to the issue of sustainability. So I'll share some slides with you. A PowerPoint policy. You don't actually have to read anything on the PowerPoint if you don't want to. If you prefer to just listen, so there won't be anything essential on the PowerPoint that's not in the presentation. In order to act as well as possible, we need to deepen our understanding of the foundations of ethics, and philosophy is something that helps us do that. It also helps us appreciate how to apply that understanding in practice. So there's going to be three sections. I'll talk a bit about the nature of philosophy, a bit about the underlying ethical ideas, and then I'll apply that to the issue of sustainability. So in philosophy, we seek to base our beliefs and our decisions upon rigorous rational arguments. We don't simply go along with what seems right or feels right or appeals to us and that sort of thing. So it's important to recognize that we've all been influenced by chance past events, so including what genes you happen to have, what upbringing, past experience you happen to have. And so an example which kind of crystallizes this is just is to imagine you are by chance brought up in a community where everyone thought the universe is 6,000 years old. Now, obviously, there are some sort of religious communities who think this sort of thing. And so that's your beliefs, one of your beliefs about the physical world, for example. And imagine it's also the case that everybody just tries to maximize their own pleasure. And children obviously copy their environment, copy the people they're with, they're brought up by. So as a child, you naturally copy them, and you're similar. But at some point, you realize, as we all realize, that it is just chance you happen to have that upbringing. It is just chance you happen to have those sort of beliefs and that way of going about making decisions. And when you realize that, you've then got a choice. You can either just say, oh, well, that's the way I am, and just kind of carry on as you are. But if you do that, you're essentially leaving to chance your beliefs and how you go about making your decisions, because they're just due to chance past events. But the alternative is to reject leaving to chance your beliefs and how you go about making your decisions. And that means trying to learn and trying to base your beliefs and your decisions upon evidence and rigorous rational argument. And that's what philosophy helps you do. And of course, in the examples I just gave, if you do that in the case of your beliefs about the physical world, then you're going to study physics and so on, and you're going to learn that the universe is around 4.5 billion years old. So then there's a question, well, what will you learn if you do ethics? So let's have a little look at one way of approaching that question. So in order to think about, trying to think sort of rigorously about how you go about making your decisions and how to go about making your decisions in future, it's important to look at what the components of your decision making are. Okay, so here's one way of analyzing this. So one aspect, one of the three main components, is your decision regarding who to treat as an unconditioned end. So this is a notion we get from Kant. He distinguishes between treating a person as an unconditioned end and treating them as a mere means. So if you treat someone as a mere means, you first decide what outcome you want, and then from that, you infer what effect have on that person. Whereas if you treat someone as an unconditioned end, you're concerned for that person for their own sake, and you're guided in your decision making by your effect on that person. So take an example. Imagine Ruth treats only herself as an unconditioned end. So she's only guided by the effect on herself, and she aims to make herself more wealthy. And then imagine she treats Alice as a mere means. So in that case, she first thinks about what effect she wants to have on herself, and then she has whatever effect on Alice will kind of bring that effect on herself. So, for example, she might be appear friendly towards Alex, because that's a way to be able to steal from Alex, or in order to get a well-paid job out of Alex, and so on. So that's that basic distinction between treating as a mere means and treating as an unconditioned end. And Kant argued you should always treat every person as an unconditioned end. So you should always be guided by each person for their own sake. The argument's roughly that it'd be arbitrary to treat some but not others as an unconditioned end. There's no there isn't time to go into the detailed argument, but we'll agree with Kant for now and run with that. Okay, so that's one component. Another component, then there's your decision regarding what effect you will try to have upon those persons that you treat as an unconditioned end. So remember, to treat someone as an unconditioned end means you're guided by them, you're guided by the effect on them. But then there's still the question of what effect you're going to try and have, how you're going to try and interact with them, what difference you're going to try to make to them. So are you going to try to make them more wealthy or more powerful? Are you going to try and harm them? Are you going to try and do what's best for them? So these are all theoretical options available to you. And then the third main component is your worldview, and in particular, your view about what's truly best for a human being. And here it's important to make a distinction between, there's kind of a qualitative distinction between two types of views of what's best for a person. So on the one hand, there's competitive goods. So competitive goods have the characteristic that if you possess a particular instance of them, then it's the case that someone else doesn't possess it. Okay, so examples include money, power, desire, satisfaction, status, and so on. So if I've got a particular pound coin, then you don't have it. And we're in competition for it. And so we have it's a zero-sum game. Either I've got it or you've got it. In contrast, the alternative is to think in terms of shared goods. So shared goods are ways of interacting which are mutually beneficial. Okay, there's examples include cooperating to pursue shared goals, building shared relationships, for example, friendship, love, camaraderie, creating beauty, sharing the experience of beauty, learning and teaching. And shared goods are the basis of win-win interactions, mutually beneficial interactions. So, for example, if you and I share a goal, then if I promote that goal, it's good for you and good for me. And if you and I share a relationship, then there's one thing there that we're both sort of participating in and partially constituted by. And if I make that one thing better, that relationship better or more beautiful, it's better or more beautiful for both of us. And likewise, if you make it better, it'll be more beautiful. So just a quick recap: 3 elements: treating as who you treat as an unconditioned end, what effect you try to have on those persons you treat as an unconditioned end, and your decision regarding how to modify your worldview, especially whether you see what's best for a person in terms of shared goods or competitive goods. So I would argue for trying to do what's best for every person, and conceiving of what is best for a person in terms of shared goods. So you treat every person as an unconditioned end, you try and do what's best for each person that you treat as an unconditioned end, and you think in terms of shared goods when it comes to trying to do what's best for a person. There isn't time now for to share the exact. Obviously, it's a short presentation for the detailed argument for that. But do get in touch if you're interested. Which of the acts available to you is best for all depends on the details of the situation. So, if, for example, if you're passing someone if you're walking through a shopping centre and you see someone who's a friend, you might go over and give them a hug, be pleased to see them. If it's a stranger, you obviously don't do that. You don't just go and grab a random stranger. So what is best for a person depends upon your relationship to them, the exact situation you're in, and so on. So although you're trying to do what's best for all, it's not that you do exactly the same thing to each person. You have to look at the details of a particular situation. So it's not that you can be friends with everyone and have romantic love with everyone, but it is best for all that everyone has friends and everyone finds romantic love and so on. Okay. Now, trying to do what's best for all clearly means trying to do what's best for both current generations and future generations. So future generations are part of the all that you're trying to do best for. So clearly a part of that has to be promoting humankind's ongoing survival and flourishing. Because without this, members of future generations will suffer great hardship, misery, death, and so on. Individuals would suffer the torment of watching their friends, family, and community. All of humankind struggle and die until none are left. So that's hardly going to be best for them. So clearly, if you're going to do best for all, it has to involve promoting mankind's ongoing survival and flourishing. And furthermore, as Samler Scheffler points out in his book, Why Worry About Future Generations, our projects, our children, everything else that we care about and which gives meaning to our lives are tied up with the ongoing survival of society. So if we knew society was going to be destroyed tomorrow, it would make a lot of things, most things, seem sort of pointless, hopeless, meaningless, and so on. So we can see that what's best for ourselves is tied up with this ongoing society that we're contributing to, and that there's a sense in which we kind of live on in our contribution towards that society and help others live on in their contributions towards that society. So you can see how it is best for all that we do continue trying to build a society which will kind of survive and flourish into the distant future. I'll just pause briefly there. Does anybody have any pressing questions, or shall I crack on, and then we can take questions at the end? Okay.
Well, I just posted a question in the comments, but I can speak it. I mean, I was wondering, does this decision-making philosophy take into account unconscious emotional drivers that people use to make decisions without, alongside consciously trying to rationalize best decisions?
Well, I think, yes. I mean, it has to take that into account. I think part of it also, though, is you need to try and become more aware of those, and because to some extent those drivers are ones which you need to try and actively work to reduce, or you have to try and develop stronger motivations to do something else. So in some cases, there can be unconscious drivers which are valuable, and then you try and sort of harness them and you bring them into the whole sort of framework. And obviously in other cases they're not so constructive. So it's very important in practice. So what's important is how you act in practice. So you develop this theoretical framework, and then you employ that in trying to modify and develop your character and your outlook, and so that as a whole, the sort of person that you are improves, so that then you act better in future. Because obviously a lot of the time we don't actually have time to sort of think things through. So what you need to, so it's a bit like, if you're learning physics or engineering, you spend a lot of time deepening understanding of the subject, but then when you're at work, you just get on and do it, because you already have that understanding that you've developed and you just apply it. And it's a bit similar in ethics. You might spend a lot of time agonizing about yourself and changing yourself and deepening understanding of ethics and how you should act. But then when you meet somebody, you're just interacting with them. You're treating them as an end, because that's the sort of person you've made yourself.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so let's see how we can apply this. So clearly, humankind faces many threats. Obviously, climate change, pollution, exhaustion of natural resources, newly evolving bacteria and viruses, nuclear and biological war, asteroid strike, risky new technologies, so new chemicals, gene editing, nanotechnology, AI, etc. Looking further ahead, eventually the sun will cool, expand, and engulf the Earth. So we'll have to find a way of preventing this, or more likely travel to another solar system. In the even more distant future, we've got issues with entropy and expansion or collapse of the universe and so on, which seem sort of totally beyond us now. But obviously, we've only been doing science. If you look at the age of the universe and how long mankind's been doing science, it's a tiny, tiny fraction. So who knows what our future progress in science will enable us to do. So you do get, obviously, the default in science, our current scientific understanding, is in the very, very distant future. There may be things we can't influence, but who knows? Certainly, we're in a position where we can work to try and overcome the threats we can foresee, and then as we go further ahead, we can try and eliminate them, eliminate more complex threats, or overcome more complex threats. The reason for mentioning this is because obviously some environmentalists focus on just on the environmental threat and think if we reduce growth, live a quiet, peaceful life with minimal impact on the world, then we can get through the environmental threats. But obviously that's not going to protect us against the other threats. So we have to balance the various threats that we face and our response to them. So an example, obviously, is the COVID-19 pandemic. It's because was wealthy and we made a lot of technological progress that we've been able to produce and fund healthcare and PPE, research and manufacture vaccine, furlough workers, and so on, which has much reduced the death toll below what it would otherwise have been. So, for society to progress optimally, we've got to harness the potential of as many persons as possible. So you have to give them a good upbringing, lifelong education, develop their character, ethics, intelligence, and so on. Organize the society in a way which harnesses these, so give people the freedom and responsibility to just deploy their talents and so on. So each individual needs to look, and then when we do that, each individual needs to look at his effect on society and the world as a whole, and consider how he can optimally contribute towards humankind's ongoing survival and flourishing. And clearly, one aspect of that is his impact on the natural world. So many everyday activities destroy, damage, or degrade the natural world. For instance, obviously, driving a petrol car destroys petrol, depriving future generations of it, throwing away a battery or electrical device contributes towards making rare metals more difficult for future generations to get hold of. And on the face of it, that was obviously seen bad for future generations. But if we were to stop all activities which damage or degrade natural resources, then society would grind to a halt. So, the clock would be turned back. Society would regress rather than progress, and that would mean that our ability to overcome future threats would be limited. And so that isn't going to promote the goal we share with future generations of promoting humankind's ongoing survival and flourishing. So what we need is some way of deciding when we should engage in such activities, such as burning petrol, using up scarce natural resources and so on, and when we shouldn't. And the suggestion is this. So if someone now alive engages in an activity which reduces the natural resources inherited by members of future generations, then he should seek to A, mitigate any negative effects, for example, promote energy conservation, carbon capture and storage, and B, compensate future generations. So that means generate goods which will be valued by members of future generations as equally or more useful for promoting their flourishing and ongoing survival as the natural resources they've been deprived of. So you look ahead, you think, it's going to be things like scientific and technical and medical research, investment in the arts, museums, architecture, infrastructure, homes, factories, laboratories, machines, transport, and so on. Developing robust constructive institutions in areas such as government, justice, universities, schools, charities, business, the media, and investing in education and improving the ethics, culture, and public life of society. So the result is that if each generation successfully implements this policy, then each subsequent generation inherits the commonwealth of natural resources plus compensation, plus perhaps other things donated to the commonwealth. So each generation should seek to ensure that the commonwealth that it passes on to the next generation is no worse, and if possible, much better, for humankind's ongoing survival and flourishing than that which it inherits. So each of us should strive to ensure, that your overall effect on the commonwealth that future generations inherit is as useful to them as possible. Ensure that the overall effect on this commonwealth that future generations inherit is such that it's as useful to them as possible for living a good life and promoting humankind's ongoing survival and flourishing, and certainly more useful than it would have been had you not had any effect on it. Only then can you be confident that the way you are living your life is best for future generations. Of course, some instances of destruction and degradation of natural resources can't be compensated for. You simply have to avoid them. For instance, acts which cause extreme climate change, acts which cause extinction of species or rare metals to be difficult to retrieve, and so on, or impossible. If we were to exhaust all the Earth's supplies of lithium and then make it and then they'd be so dispersed that in the environment it was difficult to retrieve them, that would be a massive problem for future generations. So we need to sort of try and conserve what we have and what we've got available to use. So when deciding between two or more courses of action, one should always look at the overall effect on humankind's survival and flourishing, and likewise for organizations. So organizations should assess their overall effects in conjunction with other individuals and companies on what is passed down to future generations. So in a modern interconnected economy, this can be difficult, but it's not impossible. For instance, a local law firm or cleaning firm may not directly contribute towards augmenting the commonwealth that future generations inherit, but in aiding other companies and individuals that do, they make an important contribution. So, we've seen the outline, in conclusion, we've seen the outline of an argument for thinking of shared goods as what is truly best for a person, and for striving to do best for all, including all who live in future. We saw this leads us to strive to promote the ongoing survival and flourishing of mankind. This involves taking into account one's overall effect on the commonwealth that one passes down to future generations, including, but not limited to, one's effect on the natural world, the man-made environment, so that's, buildings, bridges, wind turbines, machines, laboratories, artworks, and so on. Humankind's stock of ideas, where that also includes the arts and as well as the sciences and humanities and so on, and the understanding, culture, and ethics of members of society. Okay, thank you. So, any questions? Let me see. Where's the chat? I can't find the chat now. Any questions?
I have a sort of left field question, Dan, which is within that framework, on a scale of 0 to 10, where would you score yourself as following that framework?
Well, I think Well, largely I do. I think even, I think we all obviously, we all have our flaws. So I follow the framework in that I use it as the framework for trying to improve myself and try and, when I think about how to act and so on. Obviously, some of the time I don't really think straight, or I'm tired, or I'm under, for one reason or another, I act suboptimally, as we all do. So it's basically a case of, I think, I do definitely, it is definitely the foundation of how I view people and the world and my general outlook and how I approach the world and my decision making and so on. But obviously, I'm imperfect. So.
Well,
Dan, there was a question from Earl as well.
Hi, Earl.
It's in the chat box, if you can have a look.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you.
You can hear me.
Oh, yeah, go on. Yeah, go on.
I'm looking at, you talked about mere means and unconditional ends. I've got a question. Who decides what was useful? You talked about the arts, the sciences, the museums, making sure that you've got all of those things in place. What about previous wrongs that have been done ethically? We know certain things have been done. What about paying reparations? Where does that fill in? Where was it done in the past?
That's a massive question. I don't have time for now. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Any other questions?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's a massive question. It's really a massive question. So I can't deal with that in a couple of minutes. I'm sorry.
There's one from Ram in the chat box as well, starting with bias.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah, bias comes with your knowledge or social conditioning. How would you suggest we observe them and ensure they didn't influence our decision making? I think there is no substitute for deepening understanding of yourself. If you're it's a bit like, if you're trying to improve the functioning of a car, you first take the car apart, and then you change a few bits and you modify some bits, and then you put it all back together. And there's a sense that, we perhaps need to do that ourselves. You go into your study, you have that private time, you have the time where you try and understand how you go about making your decisions. You look at your past decision making. You think, well, why did I act that way? Obviously, we're more inclined to do that when we do something we think was bad or we're not happy with. Why did I make that decision? What went into my decision making? And you can understand then, you start to understand what actually went into your decision making, what the components were. And then you're in a position to start trying to modify them. So I think that we do definitely need to have that sort of self-understanding, that honesty with ourselves, in order to then be able to modify ourselves, act on ourselves. So, you have to be aware of that, try and be aware of what your outlook is, what your sense of your worldview, your attitude to people, all these sorts of things, in order to then be able to sort of modify them. So yeah, thank you. That's really essential.
Okay, so we have one more minute to go before we move on to Ram's presentation. So Dan, would you like to wrap up, or with one last question, or are we?
Yeah. I can ask a last question if you.
Sure.
So Dan, I was just interested in you started off with the treat others as an unconditioned end, and then the second principle, which you explained well, as treating others as valuable in themselves, not just as means to our end. Mm-hmm. And then the second principle was then we have to decide what effect we will have on others.
Sure.
I would have thought that it followed pretty automatically from the idea that other people are have value in themselves, not just as means to our ends, that we should do what's good for them as opposed to do what's bad for them.
So thanks, Brad. So I'll just mention for the others. Yeah. So commonly, the way that the notion of treating a person as an end is portrayed in the way Brad just mentioned. So he talked about value of persons in themselves. Now, I think actually we need to separate those two elements. So I think there's one thing is to be guided by that person. So you're guided by the impact on that person. So there's some criterion you employ in deciding what effect to have on that person. and then separate from, so that's one thing, but that still leaves open the question of in what way they're going to be guided. You're going to be guided by them. So you could, you do get sort of twisted individuals who be guided by somebody, but their aim is to make them as miserable as possible or to make them suffer as much as possible. So I do think we need to keep those two issues apart.
Okay, thank you.
By and which criterion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.